Hey guys, Mr. Moosak back here again with some more history for you guys. This is Indian Wars Part 2. Last time we looked at how Native Americans were being a little bit impacted by people moving onto the plains. We're going to go from here and take a look at how their reactions fuel some of the history that takes place on the plains. And so we have the conflicts happening on the plains here. Now, as we know from last week, we have more farmers, more miners, ranchers, soldiers heading onto the plains. And a lot of Native Americans who have been moved to reservations because the area that they were being pushed onto by the army and the government were having trouble with life there. Not a lot of Native Americans from the plains were farmers. They were given, here's some land, here's some seed, go farm. It's not going to work well, especially when you're not brought up or your tradition, your culture is not about farming. Also, a lot of Native Americans were very unhappy with the treaties that were being signed. A lot of these treaties were being broken. Land that was promised to certain Native American tribes were, being settled upon by Anglo or white Americans. Examples in the Black Hills on the West Coast. And a lot of this took place because of the gold rushes and the mineral rushes that we talked about here in class. And led to this big period of conflict that we call the Indian Wars. And so a lot of questions we're looking at is the idea of massacre or border battle. What do you consider these events to be? And we're going to start with the first one called an event called the Little Bighorn. And so it starts with Sitting Bull, who was chief of the Lakota Sioux, along with he gathered the Sioux tribe, the Cheyenne tribe, the Arapaho, at a place called Rosebud Creek in Montana. And one thing that they did was perform the Sundance ceremony. And one of the things attached to your notes document is a little short article about the Sundance. Please take a few minutes now. I want you to read that Sundance article, and in your notes, please write down, explain to me in your notes, what is the Sundance? And why did tribe perform that Sundance? I'm going to pause for a second while you guys do that. We'll be right back, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, guys, thank you for reading that article about the Sundance. I'm glad you guys paused and went through that. Now, obviously, the Sundance is a really important ceremony for certain Native American tribes. And when Sitting Bull is performing the Sundance ceremony, it's said in some of the documentation we have that he actually cuts his arm as part of the Sundance over 100 times. And while he's doing this, performing this 4-day ritual, he sees a vision. And the vision he sees is white men, pale-skinned men. He says, white men falling on the Sioux land. The men are upside down and falling off of horses. And the big question is, what does this vision mean? I don't know. And that's kind of the big question kind of came down. Was it the idea that they're going to get sick? Was that the idea that there was going to be a battle? And one of the things we saw is that a battle was going to happen and that the white men were going to perish. And so it leads to something called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. It's along Little Bighorn River, Montana. And so we see where there was General George Custer, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who was here. And here we have a large Native American encampment of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribe. And one of the goals that Lieutenant Colonel Custer had was to basically capture these Native American group and take them back to the reservation. So what happens is Colonel Custer was a very a flamboyant man. He was a Civil War vet. He was very flamboyant. He wore bright uniforms and a hat and a long hair and the big bushy mustache. Very kind of arrogant about how things were working. He was in charge of the 7th U.S. Cavalry. Their goal was to bring these tribes back to the reservation. He had Custer had about 500 men with him, mostly cavalry troopers. They had single-shot rifles, and they're supposed to be one of the most advanced units in the country. In fact, though, some research says that his men were very sick, very tired. They'd just been on duty in the southern United States for a long time, so there are questions about that. Also, he does have more troops in reserve, including big, heavy Gatling guns with the first ever machine gun, but he doesn't bring those with him. He's got a small group of men. And though, the Native Americans, the Native Americans had a T on their guys, he thought the Native Americans, according to the Indian agents he talked to, had about 800 warriors, when in fact the group was closer to 1,500 to 2,500. And so Custer found this village right here, based on one of the largest encampments he'd ever seen of Native Americans. And he thought it'd be easy to take. He decided to attack from 3 locations. So Custer's up here. Okay, one of the other Major Reno is here. Captain Benteen, another one was his office over here. And they planned to take over this encampment. One of the ways they did this was by capturing women and children and using them to help try and bring back the warriors. Fortunately for Custer, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were ready for the attack, and there was a huge battle where essentially the cavalrymen were slaughtered by the Native Americans. It's nicknamed Custer's Last Stand because Custer himself does die in the battle. There's a little hill over here called Custer's Last Stand where they think he put up his last final valiant fight, and then it was all done. By the end of this whole battle here, it was at the time one of the biggest U.S. military defeats ever. Out of Custer's 500 men, over 200 killed. Their bodies are mutilated. It was published in the papers with pictures, and it was a huge, embarrassing defeat for the U.S. Army, where this group of Native Americans defeated the greatest at the time greatest military unit in the United States. The impact of this is that the U.S. government sends a lot more soldiers to the plains. Originally, they sent about 1,500. They sent another 2,500 to 3,000 soldiers after the Sioux. Many of them are taken to reservations. A few of them actually tried to escape to Canada. The big chiefs of the Sioux, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, or actually escaped to Canada, where they're giving refuge away from the U.S. troops. So here's Sitting Bull. Eventually, Sitting Bull right here is brought back to the United States. He agrees to live on the reservation, where he's then watched by the Army and the Sioux police. In fact, he even goes into Buffalo Bill Cody, his Wild West show, and he appears in the Wild West show and gets paid for his appearances, almost like a little celebrity, if you will, as a man who beat the U.S. Army. Now, other examples of this are all around western United States. The Nez Perce were a tribe, means Pierce knows, by the way, in Oregon. And their ancestral lands were there, and essentially gold got found in that area, and they were told to move by the Army. And originally, they refused. They're supposed to go to a reservation in Idaho, and instead they fought this 1,100-mile running retreat battle type thing with the U.S. Army, trying to get to Canada and by Sitting Bull and other Native American chiefs that had gone there. It was a long, arduous trip. There were a few warriors, a lot of women, a lot of children, and we'll talk about this in class as well. But eventually, they were trying to do this trip through the winter, all those kind of things. And eventually, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce were stopped 40 miles south of the Canadian border. There's a 5-day-long battle in freezing temperatures, where a lot of the Native American warriors are killed, and all the chiefs of the Nez Perce are killed. I think the battle chiefs. In fact, they think Chief Joseph probably was not a battle chief; he was more of a political chief. But he was the only chief left at the end to surrender. When Chief Joseph surrenders, he has a very famous line. We'll read his whole quote in class. He says, "I will fight no more forever." And so eventually the Nez Perce are moved to Oklahoma. A lot of them died of disease, and eventually resettled on a reservation up here in Washington. Examples in Texas, there was a Comanche tribe who raided different places in Texas and Mexico, trying to avoid life on reservation. And General Philip Sheridan, Colonel Mackenzie were trying to stop them. One of the most famous Comanche chiefs is a guy named Quanah Parker. He's in the picture right here. Quanah Parker was the son of a white woman who had been taken captive by Comanche and a Comanche chief. And so he had been raiding areas trying to stay off the reservation. And what's part of what's called the Red River War, U.S. government starts to burn villages, shoot horses, those kind of things, which were part of the Comanche way of life. It was basically kind of a no-holds-barred, crush all resistance kind of thing happening in Texas, where eventually Quanah Parker is captured. Same thing said about Geronimo. Everyone knows the kind of famous thing about Plain Yellow Geronimo. Geronimo was one of the last Native Americans to ever surrender to the United States. He was born in Guale, the Apache chief. He fought against both the United States and the Mexican Army for years, starting in the 1850s up until the 1880s. In the 1880s, he left his reservation. Famous quote he had was that, I tried to be a farmer, I tried to grow corn, I tried to grow oats, and yet I still get arrested for things. So he decided to leave his reservation with 38 followers, and he was actually chased for over a year by the U.S. and Mexican armies. In the end, he is called the worst Indian who has ever lived among white settlers. Eventually, he surrenders, and the reason he left was he was trying to live as an Anglo and white American, was allowed to be free. After his capture, he did a tour of county fairs, even made an appearance at the World Fair in 1904 to have a chance to meet this famous Native American. And eventually wrote his autobiography before he passed away in 1906, which is a book that's on my list to read right now, his autobiography. By the 1880s, we see the Indian Wars end. Most Native American tribes are on reservations. I think the reservations are very, very bad. There's tons of poverty. Native Americans are trying to become farmers, but they have poor land, poor equipment, second-rate seed. It's just not working out. We also have biological issues. Things like blankets from smallpox hospitals are sent to our Native American reservations, and huge epidemics sweep through Native American reservations of typhus, which is a really high fever, smallpox, which is a debilitating, disgusting disease, the flu, pneumonia, all these things just sweep right through Native American tribes because they just can't keep up and can't survive on these reservations. Eventually, in 1887, the United States passed something called the Dawes Act. We'll talk about the Dawes Act in class, but its idea was it stopped granting big reservations to Native American tribes. Instead, they gave land to individual Native Americans for farming. Basically said, here, you're going to become a regular citizen like everybody else. Not have your own sovereign piece of land, but instead be a regular citizen like everybody else and make it on your own. And basically, it hurt Native Americans economically. A lot of times they could not keep up with technology, couldn't keep up with loans, they couldn't get loans. And Native Americans were a very tight-knit group. The idea of the tribal spirit was very, very tight. They depend on each other. And so it actually started fracturing the society where the tribes were broken up because instead of being tribal land, it was now individual land. The idea of land, individual land ownership. So a lot of land got splintered away, was passed on. There are issues of land being sold to whites, and the idea of Native Americans being forced to assimilate or join into white culture. And so essentially they're trying to make, Native Americans change their culture and turn them into white or Anglo-Americans. Ideas of clothing, of farming, of language. And even kids were taken from their homes and parents and sent to boarding schools to teach them white ways, that being white jobs, white language, those kind of things. We'll talk about boarding schools in class, but these are all parts of this topic here. Now, one thing that happens with the Native Americans is something called the ghost dance. As bad conditions continued, the tribes tried to keep, their morale up and those kind of things. And the U.S. and the Sioux were a great example of this. The U.S. government took a lot of the Lakota Sioux reservation, they broke it up and gave it to some of the whites for the gold rush in Black Hills, those kind of things. The land the Sioux has is poor. Many of the Sioux are really having trouble adjusting life as farmers. And so the ghost dance comes around. A lot of Native Americans turn to the spiritual roots of their traditions to kind of get themselves through this time. And one of these things was the ghost dance. It was created by a Paiute Indian, and essentially the ghost dance was designed to bring back the Native American ancestors and restore the Native American culture the way things were before the white guys came around. And what you would do is you would perform this dance while wearing something called a ghost shirt. And this is a ghost shirt right here. And the story of the ghost shirt was that it was supposed to make the wearer of the shirt invincible. It was supposed to stop bullets and those kind of things while you're performing the ghost dance. Well, the U.S. Army got a hold of this. Right? They thought this ghost dance idea was going to create a rebellion. It's going to cause all Native Americans to rise up and essentially start the Indian Wars over again. And the first person they think of when this happens is Sitting Bull. Obviously, he did he was blamed for the Little Bighorn, all those kind of issues. And so they go to have Sitting Bull arrested. And when Sitting Bull arrested, all of a sudden a gunshot rings out, and Sitting Bull is shot. First he's shot once in the stomach, in the chest, and once in the head. And supposedly he's even bayoneted in the back by a U.S. Army guy. But his shot that kills him is actually by a Sioux policeman who is going to come to arrest him. So in this whole thing, even Sitting Bull dies. At a place called Wounded Knee is where kind of the end of this whole Indian Wars thing takes place. The Lakota chief after Sitting Bull, a guy named Spotted Elk, after he hears of Sitting Bull's death, he leaves. And he was pursued by the U.S. Army. They think he is going to, have a revolution in revenge of Sitting Bull. And so eventually Spotted Elk, he stops as he's running away. He stops running away and surrounds the U.S. Army. What the U.S. Army does is they surround this group of 300 Lakota Sioux. And they have these guns with them. It's called a Hotchkiss gun. It's a very, very small artillery gun with a shell about this big around. They put a Hotchkiss gun on each direction of this group. Now, the medicine man in the group in a Spotted Elk group that basically said, hey, everybody, what do we have to lose? Let's put on our ghost shirts. We're going to stop the white bullets, and let's try to attack the army. Well, the U.S. Army tried to disarm the Sioux, taking their guns away and their weapons away. All of a sudden, a shot rang out somewhere. We're not really sure who fired first. It could have been a Native American, could have been a U.S. Army guy. We're not really sure. Sources point to a Native American, but that's beyond the point. And all of a sudden, the U.S. opened up at point-blank range with their rifles and with artillery guns. And by the end of this massacre, the soldiers started going crazy, shooting into the crowd of Sioux Native Americans. By the end of this whole thing, 150 Sioux were killed. 24 soldiers were also killed, but most by friendly fire because it's in a circle, it's shooting across the circle. And worst part was that a lot of the Sioux were left to lay in the snow. Eventually, U.S. Army pays to have graves dug, but this is basically the end of the last official event of the Indian Wars. It's published in newspapers, and it's the end of this whole situation of on the formal end of it. Talk more of this later on, guys. Thank you.